We're going to be looking at next the dermis or the middle region of the integument. What makes up the dermis is connective tissue. It also contains cell types like fibroblasts and macrophages, and even sometimes mast cells and white blood cells. It also contains much of the stuff of the integument, like nerves and blood vessels and lymphatic vessels, but it also contains hair follicles, oil glands, and sweat glands. It's separated into two layers, the papillary and reticular. The papillary layer is superficial to the reticular layer. So the papillary layer is adjacent to stratum basale of the epidermis. The papillary layer has these structures that appear like nubs or papules that go upward or project upward towards stratum basale. So that's where we're getting the name papillary layer, and it makes up about 20% of the dermis. The reticular layer makes up the other 80% and has a little bit more structure. It has reticular fibers and creates more kind of this structure that's protective underlying the papillary layer. Papillary layer is the superficial layer of the dermis, and it's made up of areolar connective tissue that has both collagen and elastic fibers, so it provides the dermis with both strength and stretch. Again, its superior surface, which is adjacent to stratum basale of the epidermis, has those peg-like projections, and they're called dermal papillae. That's again where we're getting kind of that papillary layer name. The dermal papillae contain blood vessels called capillary loops. They also may or may not contain Meissner's corpuscles and free nerve endings. The capillary loops, though, are there usually in abundance to provide nutrition to the cells that are nearby. And that's why the dermis is responsible for providing nutrition to the epidermis via diffusion. But most of the dermis is actually the reticular layer. That's about 80% of dermal thickness, the reticular layer. It consists of stronger, dense, fibrous connective tissue with plenty of collagen fibers. So there's a lot of resilience to the skin thanks to the reticular layer. This layer with its collagen fibers is able to keep the skin hydrated because these collagen fibers and associated chemicals can bind water. But there is also elastic fibers inside of the reticular layer that provide some stretch and recoil properties. So that dermis contains much of the stuff for the integument, so we're going to come back and look more at that dermis. But let's continue just talking about the layers of the skin. Next, below the dermis, you have the hypodermis. This is a superficial layer to muscle, so it's sometimes called the superficial fascia. But for the skin or the integument, it's actually the deepest region of the skin, and it's made up mostly of adipose and areolar tissue. So this is a subcutaneous layer. It's under what we call the cutaneous membrane, which is made up of just the epidermis and dermis. Now, there are three pigments that we want to go back and talk about. One specifically would be melanin. It's a yellow to reddish brown to black pigment that is responsible for dark skin colors and also freckles and pigmented moles. So it results from local accumulations of melanin, essentially local accumulations of melanin in granules produced by melanocytes. There is also keratin. This is a yellow to orange pigment, and it's going to be the most obvious in the palms and soles of the feet, which are areas where you have thick skin. Now, keratin can or cannot be yellow or orange, but it can build up in these layers and start to appear quite dark if you are taking in an abundance of keratin via the food you eat, like from carrots. There's also hemoglobin. This is a reddish pigment that's responsible for a pinkish hue of the skin when you blush. You can see this more or less in other individuals depending on the color of their skin. So these are just three pigments that contribute to skin color. Some are produced by cells, others just chemicals that can accumulate in the epidermis. Others are found inside of red blood cells, which can rush to those capillary loop locations or dermal papilla that are just under stratum basale. Now, these are normal pigments to see in the skin, but there are some alterations in skin color that can indicate disease, like cyanosis, which is a blue skin color, or erythema, which is a redness, or pallor, which is when someone's been blanched or has kind of a paler color than they normally would, or jaundice, a yellow cast. Jaundice is usually because of a liver disorder and shows up most actually in mucous membranes, like the white of the eyes. If you have a pallor or you're kind of paler than you normally would be, you might have anemia or low blood pressure, or just be scared or very angry. The redness of erythema might be because of a fever or hypertension or inflammation or allergy, occasionally also because of anger. And then cyanosis is a blue skin color that is due to low oxygenation of hemoglobin that is seen under the skin. There's different causes for those alterations in skin color, including cyanosis caused by Raynaud's syndrome, which is a constriction of blood vessels in the extremities. We're not quite sure actually what causes this. Then you have jaundice of mucous membranes. So again, we can see that in the whites of the eye. Usually problems again with your liver, but sometimes also your gallbladder can cause this backup of bile into the circulatory system and under tissues. And different types of rashes, like palmar hyperemia, can demonstrate a redness the skin can take on that is an erythema. There's other alterations, though, we want to talk about, like bronzing. This bronzing is oftentimes a result of inadequate steroid hormones. An example is Addison's disease, which is a hypofunction of the adrenal cortex. So if you're very pale in skin color, and then after a couple of days you suddenly look like you've been in the sun and you have quite a nice tan, but you haven't gone tanning, you haven't been in the sun, that's something you want to consider as an alteration in skin color that may be associated with disease, not just a lucky sequence. And then you have bruises, which are black and blue marks, and those are just clotted blood beneath the skin. So now that we've talked about some homeostatic imbalances, we're going to go back to the dermis and look at derivatives of the epidermis that have at least part of their structure located in that middle area. These include sweat glands, oil glands, hair and hair follicles, and nails. Let's start with glands. Glands include both sweat glands, known as sudoriferous glands, and oil glands, known as sebaceous glands. Those are the two types we're going to look at. When you talk about sweat glands, you're talking about different types. Maybe acrine sweat glands that are found in the palms and the sole of the feet and the forehead, really all over the body to a certain extent. Or maybe you're looking more at the apocrine sweat glands that are found only in the axillary and anogenital regions. Maybe you're talking about the glands in your ear that produce earwax called cerumen. These glands are called ceruminous glands. Even mammary glands are specialized sweat glands that secrete milk. So there's different options to sweat glands. Acrine sweat glands are also known as merocrine sweat glands because they merely secrete their product via exocytosis. They're abundant on the palms of the hands and soles of the feet and the forehead, but they are found all over the body's surface. They're pretty simple glands. They have a coiled tubular structure with a duct that proceeds upward to a skin surface. And at this skin surface, from their duct, they secrete sweat, and that sweat is going to empty onto the surface of the skin via a pore. So we can see that in this image. So the acrine gland is on the left. You can see its coiled tubular structure in blue located in the dermis, and then its duct proceeds upward through the epidermis, creates a pore, and that's where its secretion, sweat, will end up at the surface of the skin. Now, apocrine sweat glands tend to be a little bit larger than acrine sweat glands. They're located, though, only in axillary and anogenital regions, and they do have ducts as well, but their ducts empty into the biliary canal or space next to hair follicles. The secretion from apocrine sweat glands is also thicker. It's initially odorless, but bacteria can use the fat that's in the apocrine sweat gland secretions for metabolism, and that metabolism by bacteria gives that sweat an odor. These types of sweat glands only start to function at puberty. So here we can see the apocrine sweat gland on the right. So it also has a coiled tubular structure, but it's much larger than the acrine sweat gland. And its duct goes upward, but not straight through the epidermis. Instead, it fuses with the canal called the biliary canal that is next to the hair follicle. So that secretion, this sweat secretion from the apocrine gland, is going to proceed upward through the space of the hair follicle. We'll take a quick look at ceruminous glands. They're just modified apocrine glands. They do produce something that has fat in it, but fat to the extent that it hardens, that is cerumen or earwax. It's secreted into the ear, and these are only located in the outer ear. Now, the purpose of earwax is that it's sticky and bitter, and it's thought to deter bugs and the entry of foreign material into that outer ear. We also have mammary glands. They're modified sweat glands, which is why we're talking about them for the integumentary system. But the hormone production and regulation of secreting milk that is possible with mammary glands is talked about more in the reproductive chapters. But these glands can secrete milk during pregnancy and breastfeeding. So that's your sweat glands. Well, what about your oil glands? These are probably the ones you've had more problems with. They're also known as sebaceous glands, and these do not have a tubular structure. They have a sac-like structure called an alveolar structure. So these simple alveolar glands are found all over the body. They soften skin when they're stimulated by hormones, and their oily secretion, that we oftentimes just call oil, is actually sebum. So why do we even have these oil glands? Since they oftentimes cause problems and their ducts get clogged and they cause acne, well, sebum is supposed to prevent or inhibit bacterial growth on the surface of the skin. It also lubricates the skin and hair. Note that all the glands we're talking about that are associated with the integumentary system and called derivatives of the epidermis, they're actually found in much of the reticular dermis. So it's really best probably to say that these glands are derivatives of the dermis and epidermis. Now, the hair that we can see that's coming out of our epidermis, it starts in the dermis. But what is hair? It's just strands of dead keratinized cells, and it's produced by hair follicle roots. Now, this keratin is going to be a harder keratin than what makes up the skin, but there's many different parts to the hair itself. It has a shaft, a root, and if we look at the hair in a cross section in its individual cells, it has a medulla, cortex, and cuticle. And it's also pigmented by melanocytes, just like the skin. The melanocytes would be located at the base of the hair, much like they are in the deep regions of the epidermis. Here you can see that it's the bulb or the hair root that is located mostly in the epidermis. Then the shaft of the hair proceeds upward and through the epidermis. And it's through the epidermis we can see part of the superficial hair follicle. Now, the structures that we're seeing are really just a minimal component of the hair. Everything else that we're not seeing on the outside is going to be much more complicated, like the capillary root of the hair papilla that provides nutrition to the keratinocytes that make up the hair follicle. We're also not seeing things like the erector pili muscle, which can change the orientation of hair and whether or not it's kind of standing upright or laying down. So there's a lot below the skin that we're not seeing. The root area that we're not seeing, that lies within the scalp or within the dermis, that is where keratinization, or kind of the mitotic synthesis of more keratinocytes, is still going on. That area down at the bottom is oftentimes called the bulb or the root. We can also look at the image at the bottom right of this slide, and we can see a cross section of a hair follicle, specifically the hair shaft. You have an inside medulla, which is actually quite open and has a lot of space. And it's more the cortex and the cuticle and the inner and outer root sheath that is more protective for that hair shaft. What's the purpose of hair, though? Well, it does help maintain warmth. It alerts the body to the presence of insects on the skin, and it can guard against trauma, both from heat or heat loss. And it's also going to be just a slight cushion. And hair is distributed all over the body, even if you only think about it in certain locations. It is not located on the palms, soles of the feet, your lips, nipples, and portions of the external genitalia. But everywhere else, we pretty much have some type of hair. There's two different types of hair. Vellus, which is pale, fine body hair found in children, and the adult female. And then the hair that you probably think about the most, kind of coarse, long hair of your eyebrows and your scalp and your armpits and the pubic regions, that's called terminal hair. And depending on the hair type, there may be more or less efforts to remove it. There may be more or less efforts to tame it. In women, the ovaries and the adrenal glands produce small amounts of androgens or sex hormones, And that's normal, but tumors on these organs can cause a large amount of these androgens to be produced, and that can cause a condition of excessive hairiness where we see a lot more terminal hair called hirsutism. And there could be other signs of masculinization from this abnormal amount of androgen produced in women. The treatment for this would be surgical removal of tumors. There's also different types of hair growth. And the rate of hair growth is going to vary from one body region to another. It can be affected by nutrition and hormones and daily exposure to external chemicals. But there are things like alopecia, which is hair thinning in both sexes, that tends to be more hormonally or nutritionally based. There's things like true or frank baldness, which are genetically determined and sex influenced. Male pattern baldness is actually caused by a follicular response to DHT or dihydrotestosterone, and that is a steroid androgen hormone. But regardless of hair growth, hair conditions, there's a lot more to it than just where it's located. That's kind of our point in this chapter is just what is it, where it's located, what's going on, the basics. But if you're interested in this stuff, there's a lot of research out there that you can consume. Next, we're going to be looking at the structure of a nail. So this is a modification of the epidermis, and you find them on your fingers and toes. So more on them in the next